What happened? See, I would have made this video a lot sooner, ladies and gentlemen, but it seems that election day is no longer a concept that our country adopts. We have election days, weeks, into election month. And even as I make this video, there's two races here that are undecided that we can see right now on the New York Times. One of which was projected to be an easy win for Lauren Boebert in Colorado. Was not the case. See, took me a little bit to prepare this video to have my predictions aligned with the actual results, and as I put everything together, it just kind of is a bit bewildering in some instances, but in other instances, I was actually wrong in a good way, which we can get into in terms of Florida, New York, and even California. But this, right now as we stand, are the official results. It's going to likely, because you can check out in California, it's going to likely be a 222 to 213, which is exactly the same margin that Democrats had for the last 2 years, which doesn't really align with what we saw and what we had been seeing in terms of the approval rating for Joe Biden, et cetera, et cetera. This midterm proved something in terms of candidate quality, because both parties are at fault on that one. Now, to run down a couple quick facts here before I get really deep into it. In the 1966 midterms, the Republican Party lost the popular vote overall, in terms of nationally, lost the popular vote by 1.5 million votes and still gained 47 seats in the House. In 1978, when Jimmy Carter was president, they lost the popular vote. Republicans lost the popular vote in the midterm overall by 6 million votes, still gained 14 seats. In 1994, they won the popular vote by 5 million votes and gained 54 seats. In 2010, which was where the Tea Party pretty much rose out of the ground and came as a direct response to the beginning of the Obama administration, the Republicans won by 6 million votes and managed to gain 63 seats in the House. Here, we win by 4 million votes in 2022. We won by 4 million votes and only gained 9 seats. When we lost in 1978 by 6 million, we still gained 14 seats. Now, this here on the New York Times map that we're looking at is currently a +8. I don't 100%, it could be +9, could be +10. But let's just cut it down the middle and say it's +9 at the moment. This is the lowest seat pickup for the GOP under any first-term Democrat president since JFK, which is bizarre when you compare the approval ratings for presidents like Bill Clinton, like President Obama, like all these presidents that have come before Joe. And Joe Biden can hardly scratch 40%. We have 10% inflation. Thanksgiving just happened. Gas prices are double still what they were when Trump was in office. Gas prices on average when Joe Biden took office were $2.35, and as it stands, they're still hovering around $4, which we're supposed to, according to the press secretary, celebrate because it's no longer at $5. I don't know if we're just assumed to have incredibly short memory, but looking at these results, it seems like we do, because something didn't land. Something didn't land in terms of this right here. These are the results. This is my initial projection. 241 to 194, which even on certain graphics, when you looked at if this is the margin that the GOP is expected to win, because I did get pretty close to the margin that the GOP would win. They won by 4. Democrats had the House after the 2020 election 222 to 213. And that was in an environment that the Democrats won by 4.5 nationally. Look at the presidential race. Joe Biden won by 4.5 points. Now the Republicans win by 4 points, which is an 8.5 point shift. And yet, these are the results that we see. We, in fact, lost in the Senate. I can go to the governor's races eventually, and I'll go over that as well. But in the Senate, nothing changed. A seat like Nevada, which was going to go for probably about a 1.5 to 3 points, Catherine Cortez Masto, who the people had a net disapproval rating of, won by 0.8. Mark Kelly, and I predicted this correctly, unfortunately, and I know a couple people in my comments said that Blake Masters will win in Arizona, that Kelly will lose, and I said I just did not see it happening, and that's based mainly off of funding. And I mentioned that in the video, that the problem with these results, it's not really because the Democratic Party did good. It's that the Republican Party failed the voting base. Mitch McConnell is the biggest issue that the Republican Party faces, and he just got back to being elected Senate Minority Leader with no problem, essentially. There was a little bit of resistance, but no one changed anything. There was no changes that were made. Mark Kelly won by just under 5 points, and it's a bit more than what I projected it would be, but still not a big deal. Not a big deal there. That was one that I was already thinking we're probably not going to get that one. Georgia, I said it would go to a runoff. It did go to a runoff. Big thing, though, is Raphael Warnock is on top at the moment, and he's on top by 0.9. I knew it would be within a point. I knew it would be pretty close. It tipped off in the other direction. It is what it is. Pennsylvania was on a completely different planet. I don't know who watched the Senate debate between Dr. Oz and John Fetterman and thought that John Fetterman was even coherent enough to take my McDonald's order, and yet he's just been elected to the Senate, the United States Senate. There were polls coming from Pittsburgh after that debate. Pittsburgh, which is a lot of the area that a lot of John Fetterman's support came from. And even from that area, 88% of people that were polled said that Dr. Oz won that debate. 88%. He couldn't form a full sentence. Dr. Oz kept his composure. He stuck it to the issues. He took a more moderate stance, while John Fetterman shouted over him incoherent ramblings about Social Security.
I've talked to couples when I make their first down payment on a new house and they can't afford it anymore because of interest rates. I've talked to families.
You want to cut Social Security.
Mr. Fetterman, it's his turn for his closing.
And John Fetterman wins by 5. That's not wildly as bad as what happened with the governor's races, where, despite me shrugging off the idea that Josh Shapiro could win anywhere near the margins that Tom Wolf won, he went ahead and did just that. In terms of comparing these results between Dr. Oz and Doug Mastriano couldn't even handle Luzerne County. He couldn't take Berks County, where Reading is. He couldn't take Cumberland, or even Beaver over in Pittsburgh direction. Beaver, which Shapiro won by almost 3 points. And if you compare that here, Oz won it by 9. And this issue is not because of Philadelphia. A lot of excuses that Republicans will use is, oh, Pennsylvania flips. Pennsylvania only ever goes blue because of Philadelphia, maybe the Philadelphia suburbs. Philadelphia pretty much voted on par with how they vote every other time. In terms of turnout even, it wasn't that big of a deal. The problem is that rural Republican voters did not come out and they did not vote for Doug Mastriano or Dr. Oz. And Dr. Oz did a lot better. Now, Erie, John Fetterman won by 9 points. If I go to Erie in the governor's race, Doug Mastriano lost that by 20, by 21.6. Now, how did we do in the presidential election? Donald Trump lost it by 1, and in 2016 he did win it, although I don't have the margins up right now. But these are the election results for Pennsylvania in 2020, where Donald Trump only lost by 1.2. And you compare that to what we see now. I mean, Luzerne's solid here. Berks, not as solid, but still, it's an 8-point race. Even down here around Allentown area and Northampton, Biden got a 0.8 lead here. Compare that to the governor's race. Josh Shapiro won it by 13. Now, is this Doug Mastriano's fault directly? Somewhat. Is it Donald Trump's fault for endorsing Doug Mastriano? Would Lou Barletta have done better than Doug Mastriano in these areas? I don't 100% know. Josh Shapiro ran unopposed in terms of his primary. What does that mean? Is it Donald Trump's fault for endorsing Doug Mastriano and for endorsing Dr. Oz? Would Dr. Oz have really done that much worse than a rhino like David McCormick? No. Dr. Oz did the best he could out of any of the other candidates that were running. Dr. Oz actually brought out a lot of the area over in this side, going for him way more than Doug Mastriano. The problem is these counties that were way more solid for Donald Trump. Look at the margins here. This is 100% solid red the whole way through with a couple blue spots in between. Compare that to the governor's race. It's lighter, 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 flipped, 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 flipped. This that barely went in Joe Biden's direction was solid for Josh Shapiro. And this is because Josh Shapiro ads were playing nonstop everywhere you went. Because Josh Shapiro gets funding from the Democratic Party. To put in perspective, Mitch McConnell thought that it was a better use of money to put money into a Colorado Senate race where Joe O'Dea had absolutely no chance of winning. Mitch McConnell put money into that. So the problem is not the Democratic Party, it's the Republican Party. If I just pull up the Senate map again, in terms of money spent in battleground seats by the party leaders, by the powers that be, Blake Masters received $9 million to Mark Kelly's $73 million. 8 times more. Over 8 times more. Of course Blake Masters lost. He didn't stand a chance. In Georgia, Herschel Walker, $32 million versus Raphael Warnock, $76 million. Not as bad of a landslide, but still well over twice as much. In Nevada, Adam Laxalt got $12 million versus Cortez Masto's $47 million. Now think about if that money was just allotted slightly differently in regards to the fact that the race was within 1 point. You know, America deserves a much better leader than Mitch McConnell. A much better leader. And Kevin McCarthy in the House isn't doing much better. You know, we have exit polls from NBC, nationwide, for voters asking about what they think of Biden's policies. Half of the country said that these policies are hurting the economy. About 1 in 5 say that it's not making a difference. And then around a third of voters say that his policies are somehow actually helping the country. Those margins, in terms of hurting versus helping, is plus 14 for hurting the country, hurting people. Think about the crime rate. We have these border states where they're being absolutely overrun because the amount of fentanyl pouring through the borders, the fact that in El Paso, Texas, there's absolutely no regulation and people are just running right through with no consequence, is absurd. And a nation without laws cannot exist. So we have all these races here. You know, and I should have known that some things were going to go a bit screwy, in that our good old pal 538 decided at the very, very last second in the 11th hour to say that the Republicans have about a 60% chance of taking the Senate. I should have known the moment that they called that one. Well, I guess they just jinxed us. Because overnight, Oz's chances went through the roof. Oz, 57% chance of winning, and then he loses by 5. Laxalt getting a 51% chance of winning, which is, that's pretty fair, but they had him winning that race by about 0.2. He loses by 0.8. Not too bad. Not too bad, 538. But even here, Herschel Walker had a 63% chance of winning, and he lost by a point. But Pennsylvania, out of nowhere. And they were late to the game, too, because pretty much every single poll had Dr. Oz ahead, or at least tied, when you looked at how polls are skewed. But 5-point loss. See, I use parameters, and these are my results for the Senate, right here. This is what I called would happen. 52 to 48. And look at what happened instead. For one thing, Washington and Colorado were not as close as I said that they would be. They were 100% solid. Nevada just barely flipped. Arizona was by a bit further margin than originally anticipated. But Wisconsin, which I predicted would have probably gone by about 5 to 7 points for Ron Johnson, that was not the case at all. Ron Johnson barely won by a point. And for the whole night, I watched the results and was wondering, when would they call this? Why is this so much closer than it should be? Because Ron Johnson is an easily electable candidate in the state of Wisconsin. If Ron Johnson can't be elected, then the chance of any other moderate or standard Republican in terms of nationwide for 2024 has no chance of winning Wisconsin. Ohio, by pretty much the same margin that I predicted. I predicted 6 to 7 points, and he won it by 6, despite polls saying that J.D. Vance might get it by a point or two. That was on par. That was on par with how polls are skewed. Even this one that was by 4, when it should have been by 5 or 6, is not too off. Now, the good news is Florida blown out of the water. I predicted 10 to 12, and Marco Rubio won by 17. And Ron DeSantis, as well as Lee Zeldin, were two of the biggest winners of the night, despite Lee Zeldin not actually winning anything at all, in terms of concretely. But Lee Zeldin is the reason why the House races went the way they did in New York. I'll zoom in on New York. I mean, this race here, Maloney lost, who has a major, he's got a role in terms of party leadership in the House for the Democrats, and he couldn't even hold on to his race. He barely lost that one. I didn't even have that one going for Mike Lawler. And because of the turnout that Lee Zeldin could pull, a lot of races that should have been a lot closer in the House races ended up going for Republicans. Even Pat Ryan barely held on by a point in the 18th. And we looked at some close races up in Virginia, and this one should have been a lot closer, but things got a lot closer in terms of Nova, in terms of Northern Virginia, and they managed to flip down here in Virginia Beach area. Pretty good, pretty solid. And I can show up the 2020 comparisons. Look at New York. Look at New York here. I mean, people say the red wave didn't exist, but take a look. California, Texas, across Florida. Florida's had an insane red wave. It was not exactly a uniform red wave, but the red wave existed. A lot of red waves existed in smaller concentrations. But even when you look at the Senate map, look at the Senate races, and this is bizarre because we have incredibly red states like Oklahoma, Missouri, Kentucky, even more red states like Ohio, going way far to the left, and then blue states like Washington, California, New York, Connecticut, going way further to the right. We have red wave, moderate blue wave, red wave. Not really any wave at all, more of just like a very light splash. Blue wave, red wave, blue wave. It's very bizarre. There's no clear trend nationwide when you actually break it down state by state in the Senate races, which just proves the fact that candidate quality is a major issue. And the Republican Party can't assume that they'll win elections by throwing anybody out and hope that national environment can carry them over the edge. And a lot of reasons why I called certain House races and why my projection is so far off, I'm off by 20 seats, is because a lot of my predictions, because I don't know individual candidates, how could I know 435 people, had to do with national environment, national shifting. I was right that the national environment would shift by 8 to 9 points to the right, except it shifted by 8 to 9 points to the right in places like California and New York, and not places where there were hot contested seats. I can scroll down. How many seats are the Democrats going to just narrowly win? 0.69, 0.77, 0.7, 0.2, 0.2, 0.2. I mean, Pennsylvania. Susan Wild and Matt Cartwright held on. They had no reason to hold on. When you look at the national environment, when you look at the disapproval ratings, they had no reason to hold on. But they did nonetheless. And now, because the Republican Party did not get the night that they expected, they point fingers. And who do they point fingers at but the one person that doesn't hold any office or any power right now? And that is Donald Trump. And right now, I'm just pulling up the 2020 race for comparison's sake. But everyone seems to be pointing fingers in Trump's direction. And Donald Trump also just announced that he will be running in 2024 for president, which everyone already kind of knew, but he finally made it official. And now, as much as I love Ron DeSantis, and I think he's doing a great job for Florida, I'm seeing very concerning shifts in the fact that every rhino in existence is suddenly jumping behind Ron DeSantis, including the Bush family, including Mitch McConnell and that whole group of people. They're completely going right behind Ron DeSantis. And I have zero trust for McConnell or any of his crew. Why would they put themselves behind Ron DeSantis unless they know something that we don't? Ron DeSantis is doing a great job as governor. But how did he become governor? Ron DeSantis won his seat by 0.4 in 2018. He would have hardly won the primary if it weren't for Trump's endorsement. But he won, and then he won the general election in a blue wave year. But he won it by 0.4. And Ron DeSantis won the governorship, won his re-election against former Governor Charlie Crist by 19.5 points. Flipping Miami-Dade, flipping even Palm Beach, making Broward a lot more competitive, flipping Jacksonville. You know, I called that Miami-Dade would flip, and it flipped. And not only that, but I was surprised that even Palm Beach flipped. Ron DeSantis did a great job in Florida, and he's doing a great thing for Florida. However, why are all the rhinos putting their support behind him? Because a governor can act very different compared to how a president can act. And not only that, but despite people asserting the fact that Ron DeSantis is far more electable than Donald Trump, still using January 6th as a pointer, among other things, but Donald Trump did not lose in the 2022 midterms. Think about it. In regards to his primaries, over 95% of the candidates that he endorsed won their primaries. And in terms of races, in general elections of endorsed candidates from him, he won 80% of them. Now, they'll highlight ones, like Arizona, where Kerry Lake should have won. And I'll get into Arizona in a second. Donald Trump won that night. And there's a big talk about electability. But I had a lot closer races, as did many pollsters and many people that make these prediction videos. A lot closer races in states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, even Michigan. Although Michigan wasn't as competitive in terms of the governor race, had a lot closer of a race. There is only one person that has been able to get the Rust Belt as close as it is, and that is Donald Trump. And I'm sorry, but it's not 2000 anymore. We don't have states like Colorado, New Mexico, or Virginia. We can't win without the Rust Belt. And Donald Trump is the only candidate that's capable of carrying the Rust Belt. Sure, one can argue that Ron DeSantis can outperform in areas like Georgia or Arizona, or even do a little bit better in Nevada, but look at the national environment. I made 2 maps already. This is my map currently now, after what happened in the midterms, of Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. This is the new map. And, you know, Georgia just barely tilts in Trump's direction. Arizona barely tilts in Biden's direction. Trump still manages to barely get Nevada. But he carries Wisconsin by a lean margin. He carries Pennsylvania by a tilt margin. He barely loses Michigan. I mean, and he manages to carry the 2nd district in Nebraska. I made the same map for what would happen if Ron DeSantis ran. And sure, things get a little bit closer in some areas, but he cannot carry the Rust Belt. Ron Johnson, who's pretty well liked in Wisconsin, couldn't even take it by over a point. So what gives Ron DeSantis any greater power over that? Can't get the 2nd district in Nebraska. Not that that's a big deal, although that's a difference in terms of this race that I'm putting up here between a tie and a loss. But at what cost? We lose Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, no chance of getting Michigan at the cost of a better chance of holding Georgia and flipping Arizona? I mean, we need to look at what's really worth it here, and we can't sacrifice the messaging for the sake of trying to be safe and going the safe route. We can't. The energy that brought people out in the first place was that renegade maverick energy that Donald Trump had in 2016, where he managed to flip states like Ohio, Iowa, Florida, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, the 2nd district in Maine, and get states like Minnesota, who hadn't gone for a Republican since 1972, down to 1.5, getting New Hampshire within 0.25. The only candidate that has been able to, in modern times, get it as close as it was is Donald Trump. And even in an environment where Joe Biden won by 4.5 million votes, Donald Trump barely lost Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, still managed to outperform in Iowa and Ohio, who are still, in my opinion, Rust Belt states or Rust Belt bordering states, improving margins in Florida. I mean, what's the real difference here? Donald Trump takes Florida by 5 or 6 versus Ron DeSantis takes it by over 10. A win's still a win, and it doesn't matter when you flip between these two. The problem is, as it stands, I don't think Ron DeSantis has the energy. Look at what happened in Pennsylvania. When you take when you take someone that can't get rural turnout out. This is what happens. You lose by 5. And it's not because Democrats come out. It's because Republicans stay home. And that's the issue. Is not about, getting to maybe sway voters, but to get those people that are part of the heartland, part of the core Republican voters, to actually care, to actually come out. And the only person that has been proven to do such a thing is Donald Trump. So, we have a lot. We have a lot here. Kari Lake should have won in Arizona, and I know she's fighting it. But it's pretty marvelous to me the fact that Katie Hobbs wins despite not ever debating her opponent. Despite being in charge of running the election where voting tabulators broke down on election day at 20% of voting centers in Maricopa County, where there was massive delays, people didn't know what to do, they were being sent home. And these are areas where Republicans vote more than Democrats. On election day, where Republicans also, at a much higher proportion, are voting compared to the Democrats. Democrats tend to vote more in early voting or mail-in voting. Republicans prefer to go on election day. So what better time to have the voting tabulators not work than election day? And Katie Hobbs is in charge of running this? In 2021, Maricopa election officials launched a political action committee to stop Make America Great Again candidates, to stop America First candidates. They're election officials. They should be in charge only with nonpartisan election business. They should not be even allowed to start political action committees, let alone one that is clearly biased in favor of one side over the other. And then, all the issues were in Maricopa County, and I can pull up what we're looking at here. Maricopa County very narrowly went to Hobbs, but Kari Lake outperformed in a ton of other areas out here, compared to even 2020. Outperformed. And she loses by such a narrow 17,000 votes. Now, how does Kari Lake lose when we have flips here? When we have such a red Arizona. Look, the 2nd district, the 6th district, this thing went all red. And I even predicted that as well. It's here. He's tilting. We have 2 blue districts that flipped red in the House district, and somehow that did not translate to a governor win. It flipped blue. Now, I was very off in terms of governor races. The only flip for Republicans that I got, and the only flip that was there, is Nevada, by the same margin that I predicted it would be. But look at that. Arizona couldn't even be held on. Oregon didn't flip. Michigan was really wishful thinking on my part. But the ones that I really thought would flip were Nevada, Wisconsin, and Kansas. We do not see that here. And somehow, we're living in a world where, in terms of governor races, Pennsylvania and Michigan went further to the left than New York did. Further to the left than Oregon did. Make that make sense. And this is the importance of putting up different candidates. And that's why we're discussing Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis at the moment. If we want to band together and have a better result in 2024, we cannot back down. And we can't mince our words, and we can't slice up our messaging. Lee Zeldin had every chance to denounce Donald Trump. Lee Zeldin had every chance to set himself aside and say that he does not endorse the behaviors or the candidacy or the policies of Donald J. Trump. But when he had that opportunity to denounce Trump on the debate stage with Kathy Hochul, he defended Donald Trump. And you know what the results of that was? The results were a fully red New York. When you look at shifting from 2020, margins that changed from maybe 10 points to up to 20 points in certain counties. New York went by 5.7 to Kathy Hochul. Lee Zeldin needs to be either Speaker of the House or Chairman of the Republican National Committee. And someone like Josh Hawley or Rand Paul needs to be made the minority leader in the Senate. Not clowns like Mitch McConnell who would rather sabotage their own party. He's the reason why they lost the Senate in 2020. He's now the reason why they lost again in 2022. You'd think the guy that would want more power, since he's still refusing to resign despite being older than dirt. I mean, one of the biggest victories that we have is that Nancy Pelosi is no longer going to be Speaker of the House, and she's stepping down from any leadership role. But instead, the candidate that seems most likely to replace her is a candidate that outright denies the validity of the 2016 election. But what does that matter, right? I mean, I have to dance around my words talking about this video in terms of what happened in Arizona, what could have probably happened in Wisconsin, Nevada, Pennsylvania. I have to mince my words. But I just saw a clip this morning of Hillary Clinton telling China to help influence our elections. Hillary Clinton, who asserted that Russia influenced the 2016 election, refuses to admit that she lost, claims that the election was stolen from her, pushing that false Russia theory that she knew was false to begin with. 3 years of investigations, $33 million in taxpayer money later, and we know that it's completely fabricated and was fabricated by the Clinton campaign. But she can go out, run around, and be on NBC with Rachel Maddow and claim that elections are stolen, tell the Chinese Communist Party to come along and influence our electoral system for us. She can do that. Stacey Abrams can dance around for 4 years and claim that she never lost her election. She loses by 7 points. She finally admits that she lost this time around, but she still can't get over the fact that she lost in 2018. Now we have someone that's going to be replacing Nancy Pelosi who refuses to say that the 2016 election's valid. I mean, the double standard. In 2000 and 2004, both times when George Bush won, there was Democrats in Congress that spoke out against the results on certification day. And now, if I even use the words election fraud, this video gets banned off of YouTube. It gets flagged. There's all kinds of banners about how our electoral system is secure and safe. And yet I get pictures, and I see pictures of people of the Democratic Party who are bragging about voting 5 times in this election, the election before that, and the election before that. We have Katie Hobbs, who's in charge of the voting tabulator machines that conveniently crashed despite being tested the day before and working 100% fine. Katie Hobbs, who refused to debate her opponent despite losing in 13 of the 15 polls right before Election Day, only tying in one of them, barely winning in the other one, refuses to debate and just sits there and goes, I know I got this. Well, of course she knows why she got this. The key is running the system. The key is ballot harvesting. The key is holding on to these votes and then dropping them in at the very last second. They see how far down they are. Oh, do I need an extra 10,000 votes to pull this one off? We'll hold on to the votes and count them at the last second. Hence, we have election month. And the thing is they're not going to change. And they run these systems where we can't change the laws. So the Republican Party needs to start doing the same thing. Because all we ever do is play nice. And all we ever do is dance around and act like we have this moral high ground while we continue to get fucked over. And it is what it is. But people like Mitch McConnell are the reason why the Republican Party will never win. And he can't be in charge 2 years from now if we happen to be fortunate enough to retake the Senate. See, no one knows what's going to happen with the primary with Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump if Ron DeSantis even decides to run. Although the fact that Ron DeSantis refuses to state whether he will or won't run is what's really getting under Donald Trump's skin, and is what is also really stirring this rivalry that is now existing between the two of them. Ron DeSantis is where he is because of Donald Trump, and so is the rest of the country. States like Iowa and Ohio would not be solid red if it weren't for Donald Trump. And the Republican Party thinks that they can just soak up all of Trump's wins and then take it for themselves and dump him at the soonest chance that they have? I don't think so. He's the reason why we got here in the first place. And if we're going to go across the finish line, then we ought to bring him with us. And it ought to be under his lead. Because think about the record unemployment. Think about the record low inflation. The low crime rates. The border security. The peace deals in the Middle East. Think about draining the swamp and getting these people like Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell permanently out of politics. We'll never have term limits. Not as long as Mitch McConnell's around. We won't get there. We won't get there until we change our mindset. This is pure political pandemonium. And we as a country need to do better.